recording afterwards.
Okay, and the recording also, yes, absolutely. Okay, so we are here, so DCU Business School has run a number of webinars like this recently, and I think maybe a couple more to come, where we talk about the state of individual sectors at the present time, maybe the impact of the virus on them, if that's relevant, or where they stand in any event. And this one plainly is about aviation. And we don't need to say that the virus has had a dramatic effect on aviation. So we'll talk about that this morning. I'll giving in the main personal views. I think it'll be obvious where that's the case. In DCU, so we offer two, for anybody who doesn't know, we offer two degree programs at the present time. One is the undergraduate degree for school leavers in aviation management, which is a 4-year program and fairly comprehensive. And then we also have a postgrad course, executive management course for people who continue to work, but spend a couple of days a month in DCU and study aviation leadership. And we have a team of people obviously here who provide those degrees. And then we have a much larger team of people who are in the industry who supplement what we do ourselves. So I'd like to thank a couple of my colleagues, Dr. Marina Eftimiou in particular, for comments on the slides, which I distributed at the last minute. Now, what I hope to talk about, maybe for about half an hour, and then we can have a discussion at the end. Discussion might be about the slides, or it might be about the industry more generally. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is, the problem the industry faces. We're essentially familiar with that, so we don't have to take too long with that. A little bit about recovery prospects insofar as we can plot those out. Then talk a little bit about government policies in response to the virus. And in what form are those helpful in general, helpful to the aviation industry? In what form maybe are they not helpful? That will take a little bit of while, and then I'll talk also briefly about climate, because I'm expecting at least that there will be an entanglement in the future between lessons that some people will draw from the government's response to the virus and what will be recommended as a response to carbon emission problems. And again, no more than government intervention generally. In my view, at least, there are better and worse ways to proceed concerning the climate, and I'll talk very briefly about those. We'll then have some conclusions and some questions. Throughout the presentation, there are some footnotes where there are documents that people may want to follow up and read, or presentations people may want to follow up and read. And part of the purpose of today is to gather those together, bring them to your attention, and if they're relevant to what you're interested in or your work, you can have a look. Okay, so the problem is plain to describe. There has been devastation to aviation since the virus arrived. And what's different really is the scope of it. So it's not an airline problem, it's not an airport problem, it's both of those things, plus air traffic control, plus a big problem for the manufacturers, a big problem for the suppliers to the manufacturers, potentially a serious problem for those companies leasing aircraft to airlines, and even on a much more modest scale for education and training bodies, pilot training, DCU and other places. There has been for sure an impact as well. Well, there's been a general impact at DCU, obviously, but for aviation in particular, we have the same uncertainty that everybody has about what the future holds. Now, if you want computations about the cost of the shock, maybe to airlines in particular, you can find material on the IATA website, IATA being the trade body for airlines. You can have a lot of computations there, and they show big numbers for the impact on the industry of the virus. Now, I do think, I'm actually more optimistic about aviation's recovery today than maybe a month ago. We see signs of life for sure in the airline industry already, and there may be more to come, but I think there will be more to come. I think in some form air travel has to survive. I mean, for instance, I have a brother in Dallas, and I don't expect to sail, swim, or walk the North Atlantic. So for me to see him, for him to see his family in Ireland will involve air travel. And even on the short haul side, where it's not so clear what happens, and even if we push aside the sort of frivolous kind of travel, if we call it that, trade, tourism, other sectors of the economy, even you know, business travel, political travel, all involve air transport. So in some form, the industry will be there. That would be my assessment, at least. But it might look quite different to what's been here before. Now, equally, it might not look quite different. So I recall after 2008, after the financial crash, sweeping predictions about how nothing would ever be the same again. You know, the housing industry in Ireland, the banking industry in Ireland, and those two industries in particular look pretty familiar. So it's easy to exaggerate, I think, the scope of the change, and we'll just have to wait and see. Just as regards the resilience of the industry, if you like, I mean, here are just two very simple charts, 20 years worth of passenger trends in Dublin, but also aircraft movements on the runway. And there are periods of growth, periods of decline. The periods of decline are followed by new periods of growth. The numbers are higher at the end of the period than at the start. So if you look at the historical record, there are good grounds for thinking that when the economy is strong, aviation growth is strong, and vice versa. Obviously, the particular change experienced at the present time is not like these. These are just the standard economic cycle. This is a more widespread, let's just call it political shutdown or health shutdown. Maybe that makes things different, but then again, maybe it doesn't. I'll say slightly more about that. Okay, what speed might we see recovery at? When might things be at least stronger than today? Well, there are some managers in the industry who are confident that parts of the industry will recover quickly. So I listened to a CAPA webinar 2 weeks back. The boss of Wizz Air was speaking, and he was very bullish that his company, his airline, would be back pretty well to normal in about a year's time. But he thought that the full service carriers, the legacy carriers, whatever you call them, would struggle maybe ever to get back to where they had been. And of course, during that stage, the low-cost carriers might have stolen passengers and routes and all kinds of things. Stolen obviously isn't the right word there, but taken passengers and routes. And that there might be permanent shrinkage, let's say, in the full service carriers. In other words, that would be reinforcing a pattern that's obviously been there for a very long time. Now, of course, he said what would obstruct this kind of change would be big injections of government money into essentially failed companies, failed airlines, which would make it hard for Wizz to compete with those companies. The company that comes to mind, the airline that comes to mind fairly obviously is Alitalia. You'll see from press reports that the Italian government is contemplating putting 3 billion euros into an Alitalia that they would have bought into public ownership. It's about 2 years since 750 million was injected. It's about 4 years since an earlier injection of 500 million was made. It's pretty hard. You know, obviously the prices that Alitalia will charge with these kind of funds in the bank are lower than it would charge without them. And of course, for airlines that compete with Alitalia, competition is certainly not on a level playing field. So the Wizz Air boss would be happy to see unsuccessful companies, unsuccessful airlines just close down and leave the market to companies like his own. In any case, if anything along those lines occurs, we might expect to see restoration of air services, relatively quickly. Ryanair has announced something not so different to that. EasyJet, likewise. We know there are planes in the sky again. Eurocontrol, interestingly, on its own website, is putting up screenshots and so on of air traffic at the present time, and it's taking a date a year ago and a date now, and comparing them. For a good while there, that comparison showed a lot of planes in the sky 12 months ago and essentially none now, but maybe it will start to turn around. Other people, not speaking specifically about aviation, like Paul Krugman in the New York Times, argued that because of the nature of the closure, the recovery might be equally, it's like if you switch the light off, then you switch it back on, you hope the light comes back on. That's rather speculative. But there are some things that will affect dramatically the kind of reopening that aviation and other sectors achieve. Obviously, one state of the world is one where there's a vaccine. It's manufactured on an enormous scale. It's distributed on an enormous scale. That would be one scene which would restore aviation to more or less where it had been. That's in the hands of researchers, and you can't predict how that will work out or fail to work out. The other option, which is, I would say, pretty disturbing, is one where the distancing rules end up applying more or less indefinitely. Now, the distancing rules cut the capacity of businesses, sometimes dramatically. DCU itself sees how a lecture hall with the distancing rules can accommodate far fewer students than without them. Airlines are making noises along the same lines, Dublin Airport along the same lines. Easy to see how it would affect small restaurants and so on. And there's a sense in which the distancing rules mean that there isn't a reopening. So if the government says everything is reopened, but by the way, there are distancing rules, it might mean that the capacity of a lot of businesses is still much less than 100%. So there's a partial opening, not a full opening. And at that partial level of opening, the revenues that the companies can hope to obtain might not be sufficient to cover their costs. So that would be, that would make that would make it difficult for the economy to resume anything like normal service. Now, is there an alternative to that? Well, there appears to be an alternative to that. It's not on offer today, but it could be developed and made available next year, for example. So, and this alternative is you test the whole population maybe every 2 weeks for whether they have the virus or not, whether they have the infection. People who are found to be infected, those people are quarantined. They're put in a place where they're not able to infect other people, but then everybody else carries on as they used to, maybe including an absence of distancing. So there's a long discussion of 1 hour on YouTube, an interview with a guy called Paul Romer, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, who makes a very strong case that we can't really carry on for much longer with closure and distancing, particularly when he argues there is a far better policy. Now, I would suggest you might like to listen to that video, especially if you play it at high speed, because then it doesn't take a full hour to listen to. And I mention it in a discussion about aviation because at least as much as other sectors, the policy in force next year, whether it's continued distancing, whether it's a shift to something like population-wide testing for the virus, that will have a big effect on how aviation and other sectors recover. The same argument was offered in a newspaper article in the Sunday Business Post a couple of weeks ago by a Maynooth professor and colleague of ours in the business school, Edgar Morgenroth, has written some op-eds and taken part in discussions about, again, what the costs of the current policy are and what the alternatives to it are. So I mentioned that because it matters to aviation. Leaving that health policy to one side for a minute, there is the question of, for companies that have been closed down and have no income now, and in the ordinary course of events would collapse, what policy has the government offered and what does that mean? Well, we kind of know what the policy is. There are wage subsidies and so on. There are probably going to be bailouts in some form. The perfect policy here, or even the recommended policy here, is easy to write down. If an industry needs cash to remain in existence, one option is to offer support to an industry without picking winners, without singling out individual firms for the lion's share of the cash. There's a few reasons not to pick winners. It's not possible. You'd need to know how the economy of the sector would develop into the future to know which companies would be successful. If you go back 30 or 40 years and you imagine whether anybody could have contemplated that Ryanair, with a couple of biplanes in Waterford, would become more or less the largest airline in Europe, that would not have seemed like a very plausible bet. And so because you can't see one reason that you shouldn't be trying to pick winners is you can't see the future. The other reason, of course, is if you funnel your cash into a small number of companies, you really heavily distort competition, as between companies that don't benefit from your funds and the ones that do. But also there's an effect as between rich and poor countries. Reportedly, Lufthansa has benefited from about 8 billion euros of cash. Well, sorry, 8 billion euros of support, loan guarantees in some cases, grants in others. Obviously, those are different things. An airline in Portugal or Greece or wherever is not going to have a government which can provide support on that scale. The wage subsidy, on the other hand, in force now, supports the economy generally, doesn't discriminate between companies, and therefore doesn't get involved in picking winners. Now, whatever form government involvement takes, we're pretty well certain to have a larger role for the government in the economy generally, in aviation in particular, in the future. And leaving aside purely ideological questions, there are simply some business implications of that. We've seen already how in the early months or days of the crash, governments instructed their air traffic control companies just to stop charging airlines. So that's a kind of a drastic policy to apply to a government-owned firm, and it arises because of government ownership. So if you have a lot of government influence on companies, there is likely to be, over time, not straight away, but over time, the companies will be asked to do things that erode their own profitability. So I think the Shannon stopover would have eroded the profitability of Aer Lingus and discouraged North American airlines from flying to Ireland. The government was very keen in the early 2000s to have a direct air connection between Dublin and San Francisco for multinational companies, Google executives and whatever. And the chief executive of Aer Lingus at the time pointed out that on a normal day, his company would sell 7 seats, 7 tickets, Dublin, San Francisco, and how it was just impossible to run an air service on that basis. So you have a conflict between political goals and business goals, and if a company is run because of the first, with the view to the first rather than the second, it will face economic difficulties over time. And the irony there is, of course, that the airline will then be financially weakened and will come back to the taxpayer in the future looking for more money. So we should be, there are better and worse ways to support the economy, support aviation, and these are some of the considerations. There is also, secondly, there, item 2, you would like to be able to separate companies that are in trouble for reasons that have nothing to do with the virus, but are poorly managed or made bad investment decisions, from companies that have been hit by the virus alone. And they're the company that comes to everybody's mind, I'm sure, is Boeing, which has, according to press reports, received and is going to receive a huge amount of billions of dollars, even though, while the virus has certainly affected its bookings, there's a lot of other reasons for it's being in difficulty. But again, the political system doesn't deal with that terribly easily. Now, if you look at the bottom of the page there's a website, garsonline.de, which has a lot of material. One of the things which it has is a document. So the World Conference of Transport Research Societies has prepared a few pages of advice to governments about responding to the virus in the transport area in general. So it's not limited to aviation, a lot of surface transport advice and so on as well. But for our purposes, I've just picked out a couple of things where they make the following argument. They say there's a danger that doctors will tolerate a lockdown or encourage a lockdown because they'll be looking at medical issues and not so much at economic issues. Business leaders, on the other hand, will be very conscious of damage to the business and industry and will maybe downplay the medical side. So the advice coming from both of these sectors might be, neither one on its own is the right advice, if I can put it like that. We normally rely on governments and ministers to adjudicate between conflicting advice of this kind. So let's hope that's what's happening in this country at the moment. There's then also the consideration that if governments inject a lot of money into a company, whether it's a bank or an airline, they will normally look for some of the shares of that company so that in the future they could sell those shares if the company recovers and then replenish the money that the taxpayer put in the first place. But there's a question as to whether you would like those share ownerships to be voting or non-voting. So if it's non-voting shares, you still protect the taxpayer, but you don't give as much scope for political decision-making in the companies. With voting shares, it's the reverse. Now, let's turn, if I may, to climate issues for a moment. So one reason to talk about this, I think, is that as anybody involved in aviation, I think will have appreciated over the last year, maybe in particular, and leaving the virus completely to one side now for a second, I'll come back to that. The popularity or the standing of the aviation industry generally in the community, certainly in the parts of the community sympathetic to environmental considerations, has been falling. And I think airlines need to do something about that. And there are what you might call gestures that airlines could make to demonstrate that they're taking climate issues more seriously. And then there are policies that governments might put into effect, which are certainly not gestures, but are will have a consequence for the operation of airlines, as well as giving an incentive for activities which reduce carbon emissions. So flipping back to the slide now for a second, one thing that the virus response has shown is that enormous efforts are possible in certain circumstances. The virus has produced a response that, you know, you could hardly have envisaged. Why a big response there and nothing like that yet on climate? But I think the issues there are fairly clear. With the virus crisis was now. It was in our faces right now, and it was obviously costly. People were dying right now. One of the challenges about getting attention to climate is it seems to be in the future, and the scale of the problem is, you know, disputed. So the reasons that made a big mobilization possible for the virus don't seem to apply with climate, but nonetheless, the demonstration has happened, and that a big response is possible seems clear now. But of course, the shutdown has produced a horrendous economic effect, and we don't know yet, as the terms of the shutdown are lessened, how many companies will recover. So we don't know the cost, the full cost into the future. That said, what could be done to treat climate seriously in the aviation sector without, you know, wiping out the economy? Well, you know, economists are boring and repetitive, but they talk about carbon taxes. I was speaking to somebody before Christmas, and they were in a car showroom. They were going to buy a car, and they could see petrol and diesel cars, and they could also look at electronic vehicles or electric vehicles. And the electric vehicles were about 15,000 euros more expensive to buy, given the scale and the model and so on that this guy was looking for, than the carbon and diesel vehicles. So the position we're in today, just taking motor vehicles as an example, is that the less carbon emitting option or technology is much dearer than the other ones. And therefore people are kind of recoil. What a carbon tax would aim to do is to flip that around. Electric vehicles might attract a negligible carbon tax or none at all, and the other vehicles would attract a large carbon tax, and the price might flip around. So economists would say the relative prices there have changed. And then nothing else is required. In the sense that the public just sees a completely different relativity for prices and acts accordingly. What about aviation? Well, air travel essentially is underpriced at the moment. There isn't any carbon charge to take effect, to price in the carbon effects. And then there are other things which are just historic and don't make any sense now, relating to VAT on ticket prices and what are standard fuel taxes in other sectors. So were these to be applied, air travel would be more expensive, and ordinarily people, you would expect, you know, with a high degree of confidence that people would buy less air travel. One of the things I think that, for sure, one of the things that this recent crisis has shown is that a lot of people go to Italy earlier in the year for skiing and who knows what. And part of the reason they're doing that is that they're not paying the full price. and they would do less of it if they were paying the full price. So were there to be carbon taxes, there's an obvious sense in which it seems harmful to aviation. But from a public policy point of view, we shouldn't be continuing with services where we know right now that there's underpricing of those. And then to bring us back to something I mentioned earlier, I think this might be a costly gesture, but it would be an indication that aviation was taking climate change seriously. And let me see what I want to say there. And well, certainly that would be, it wouldn't be in so many people's bad books then. Now, why mention this in a presentation right today? Well, of course, one reason to mention it right now is that carbon taxes would generate revenue, like ordinarily, conventionally would generate revenue. You can jig around with things to offset that if you wanted to, or largely offset it, but for the most part, it would generate revenue, and governments will be looking for revenue. We can't say yet what the cost of the virus has been, but insofar as it's passed over onto the national debt, which is certain, and even though interest rates are low now, governments will be, a point will be reached where governments will be looking to, will have a higher interest to pay on those debts, or will want to make outright repayments. So we've seen how the whole industry and all the different parts of it have been affected. The recovery prospects for parts of the industry may be better than they seemed when the crisis began. There are definitely better ways for the government to prop up aviation and other sectors. But however that's done, there's likely to be more government involvement in aviation and the economy generally in the future. And then no more than supporting the industry today, there are also better and worse ways to contemplate dealing with the climate crisis. And the two may be connected because lessons are drawn from one to the other, and also because the debts of the virus will make governments more interested than they seem to have been to date to levy more taxes. Now, at the bottom of this slide, there's more reading that you might want to have a look at. So starting at the very bottom, there is material. There will be a series of webinars. There has been a couple of webinars already. There'll be a series of future webinars on you can find the details on GARS. 1 week from today, there'll be a webinar specifically on bailouts, aviation. The GARS group involves people in Australia, Canada, Germany, and all points in between. So it's a much more international group than listening to me this morning. CAPA also has had some webinars, and they typically, you can register even when you can't attend, and you can get the detail, the presentations and so on afterwards. On the broader sort of political issues, I mean, I was struck, there's a columnist with the Financial Times, Gideon Rachman, who wrote a pretty strident piece early in May about how, insofar as people think that competition and related policies have stimulated the economy for a number of decades now, and that would certainly apply to aviation, they better speak up in the coming years, because there'll be the opposite conclusion drawn by some people. I saw a tweet a couple of weeks ago from a TD who I won't name, who said airline privatization has clearly failed. We should renationalize Aer Lingus. The connection between that and the virus was lost on me, but people may still see a connection. And time will show us what actually happens in aviation. So, Do questions occur to anybody at this point?
A good number of questions, Cathal, that I
Okay.
could go ahead and ask you. Has the shift from carrying passengers to carrying cargo in the recent past been a viable revenue resource for airlines? Any data or any insights on that?
No data, although there might be a case for looking now. I mean, my impression is that when a plane flies from A to B, the bulk of the revenue comes from the ticket sales to the passengers. But I could certainly check that and try and see. So I think airlines may be flying cargo at the present time, partly to remain active, and partly because some of that cargo is important in the present situation as regards medical materials and so on.
Okay. Can any lessons be learned from the unpronounceable volcanic ash situation that emerged a couple of years back? Are there any learnings that we can take from how the airline industry or the aviation industry bounced back after that? While understanding they're very different things, because that was much more short term than what we're looking at the moment with COVID-19.
So I think afterwards the question raised was whether European airspace needed to be closed to the extent that it was at that time. And for sure, exactly that question will be asked about the economic closure of recent months, not restricted to aviation, but in general. I mean, I would say looking at both of those things and contrasting the Asian situation with the West European situation, the lesson really is preparedness. How much spare capacity are we prepared to have, in hospitals or in other ways, in case? I mean, there seem to be people who believe that this is the first of many viruses. I mean, I just don't know enough about that to know if that's a reasonable forecast. But I think preparedness is a lesson that will be drawn from the experiences we've had now and possibly from the volcanic ash problem as well.
I'm getting a lot of questions here related to jobs within the aviation industry. So
okay.
I'm going to bank them broadly under one question, and
sure.
I think there's a lot of interest in this topic from people listening to the webinar this morning. So one person is asking, do you think we're looking at wide-scale layoffs or redundancies and within the aviation industry, and that this may be is a convenient reason for people to be made redundant at the moment? And looking at the likely short-term impact on jobs within the sector in terms of if people have already been laid off and whether or not they may be rehired anytime soon.
Okay, well now that's a timely question for a reason I'll explain in a minute. So I think it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that in the short term, couple of years, employment in aviation will be affected. Very hard to avoid that conclusion. But as I said in some of the early slides, I would expect a strong recovery after that. Now, I said it was a timely question because we as in DCU Business School are about to put some videos on our website, expect to have some videos to put on our website soon from aviation chief executives in a number of sectors, airlines, air traffic control, and so on. And the message from the chief executives will be that people, particular people who are studying aviation or studying aviation should continue on that path, because the companies that the chief executives run have always employed aviation graduates and expect to do it on at least the same scale in the future as the past. I think there is a sort of a paradoxical argument which says the more difficulties that aviation faces, the more it will need younger, clever, well-educated problem solvers who will be available to the industry to address the different challenges, not simply the current challenge. But you know, a lot of the employment story will depend on how quickly maybe the larger airlines recover. Some of them have spoken about it requiring a couple of years to get back to them carrying the number of passengers they carried last year. But I mean, the truth is, I think a lot of the redundancies that are being implemented now are precautionary, because it's always fairly hard to tell the future, and it's certainly hard to tell the future now. I think, you know, things like distancing rules will have a big bearing on the speed and the way in which companies recover. If I was talking to a child of mine or a neighbour's child or anybody like that, I would, and they had a strong interest in aviation, I would be saying to them that the traditional employers will need people like DCU graduates, and that, you know, not to think that everything is over now.
Okay, the next question relates to state aid being used to bail out specific airlines, as you mentioned Alitalia.
Yeah.
Have you got any comments around market disruption and I guess even competition within the industry if such a thing comes to pass, and how it's likely to disadvantage private airlines against publicly owned airlines?
Well, it's just very bad news. As I say, it's a politically motivated response. The European Union and maybe big parts of the world have spent many decades sort of unwinding that instinct, developing competition policies, developing state aid rules and the like, relying on European Commission and similar bodies to investigate and prevent actions of this kind. But I mean, it absolutely interferes with competition. It absolutely makes life much harder for the companies who are not being helped, or the companies who don't need help, or the companies who will be going head to head with the airlines that are getting, you know, large amounts of state aid. But sort of some academics in a business school do a whole lot about that.
Okay, next one is, what kind of increased costs are we looking at if carbon taxes do come in? So that would be increased costs onto the consumer, onto the person buying the airline ticket. Okay,
so I have seen a few calculations there. I mean, I think it would be material. I mean, we'd notice it. The British government, in a related move, created this air passenger duty some years back, maybe 10 years ago. One level of the duty or the tax applied for, you know, all trips. The other, much higher, applied for long-haul transatlantic trips and all of that. And those were, you know, large taxes. There's no getting away from that.
Okay. Do you think lessors have done enough to minimize the risk of an airline becoming bankrupt at the moment?
Well, I suppose, like everybody, the lessors and the airlines are trying to protect themselves as well as protect their customers. So if an airline in possession of a lot of leased aircraft, or if many airlines lease many aircraft close, the leasing companies find this large fleet of aircraft that they that they'll struggle now to find customers for, and their own the lessors will typically have bought these planes from manufacturers, expected to recover those costs from the airlines that are leasing the aircraft. So the lessors will be looking very much to their own. So there's a certain amount that they can do. I mean, it's not in their interest to put airlines out of business, but they need enough. There's only so far they can go in offering relief and so on cost to the airlines. So it's a little bit, air traffic control is in the same situation. They could reduce their charges somewhat to make life easier for the airlines, but they need to cover their own costs as well. The airports are in just the same situation. There's an interconnectedness between significant parts of the aviation industry, whereby you can only reduce one person's costs by reducing another company's revenues. So there may not be a resolution which, so to speak, makes everybody happy.
Right, we've got lots of questions still to get through. The latter end of them are related mainly to aviation finance. Just two before we get to aviation finance and leasing. One, how will the corporate aviation sector recover? Two, does the aviation industry acknowledge the science behind emissions? A more general question there on the latter part, I think. But the first on corporate aviation, the second on the aviation industry's attitude towards emissions.
Okay, so arguably the corporate sector will find it much easier to recover than other parts of aviation. I mean, senior executives who travelled on corporate jets will want to, as soon as prohibitions are lifted. It may not be quite on the same scale as before, but I think that's an exceptional corner of the industry which might be less affected than other parts. Turning to emissions, hypothetically, managers might understand perfectly well what the story with emissions is, but not want to bear the costs, place the costs on their own companies. So I think there's a disconnection. Just because you understand what's happening doesn't mean that you want to bear the cost of that.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily due to any failure in understanding that emissions matter. Although in a public forum or a public debate, you may take a position whereby all of this stuff is rubbish, but you may know, to be a chief executive of a significant company or a significant airline, you generally need a lot of brains between your ears. So there's a lot of things you'll understand, but you may not want to admit that.
In terms of ensuring a level playing field, how important is it that the European Union coordinates pan-EU aviation recovery efforts?
Okay, well, I would say it's essential. If you look at the website of the European Director General for Competition at the moment, they have taken a position, let's just say, of pragmatism, and probably because they feel some, on pragmatic grounds, some concessions have to be made at the present time. French President Monsieur Macron very recently talked, as he often does, and as counterpart often do, about how a new way of dealing with competition has to be, and state aid and the like has to be found, by which they just mean the old way, what they would do themselves if they didn't have oversight by the European Commission. So I think a lot of, in the short term, I hope it's only the short term, a lot of concessions would be made. There's a long list of state aid initiatives that the Commission has approved since the crisis became acute. I think the question is whether that can be staunched and something more strict applied afterwards. But the whole, you know, one reason the European Commission is there in the very first place is to prevent countries only doing things that are strictly in their own interests but are harmful to their neighbours. So, but I mean, I think you can see that at the same time, you take a very hardline position and you just say, Alitalia, who cares? Let them go bankrupt. I mean, that wouldn't go down very well either, especially in Italy. So I think they're like a lot of people, no more than the case we talked about the lessors. They're trying to steer a course between what they would really like to do and what they feel has to be conceded under current circumstances, with the intention of getting back to their preferred position as soon as possible. So to answer the question, it is, you know, to have any hope of limiting aid to airlines and the like, it has to be, the European Commission has to take back its own responsibilities.
Next question is on shares. Do you believe a limit to share buybacks and dividends to allow to build up cash reserves to survive future global shocks as a way not to rely on taxpayers bailing out companies who practice share buybacks to increase share prices?
Okay, well, two things to be said about that, kind of emphatically agreeing with that question. A company cannot logically go to the government or the taxpayer and say, we're short of cash, we'd like a loan or we'd like a grant. And meanwhile, back in head office, there's cash being dispersed to bonuses for senior managers, generous dividends to shareholders. I mean, you know, you do one or the other. And if you need cash from third parties, then you have to preserve that, and you don't throw it away on other uses. There is a more general point, though, going back over the last 10 or 20 years and going far outside aviation, as to whether share buybacks and similar things, I mean, they dissipated what would otherwise have been reserves that a company had, let's call it, for a rainy day. And if companies had taken the rainy day perspective more seriously for the last few decades, then fewer of them would be looking for money from taxpayers.
The next question you possibly have already answered in your response to two questions back, but to express it directly, it is, how do we address the realpolitik of member state governments supporting flag carriers? The Commission can step up to the plate in ensuring a level playing field and act as a conduit for the distribution of any industry-wide cash injections.
Well, I think what had been happening for a couple of decades was some slow progress being made in that area, responsibilities moving from, say, national finance ministries to European, you know, international Brussels bodies. We see that in central banking and a lot of other areas. And yet, you know, in a political system, in a democratic system, if a majority of the commissioners sitting in the European Commission won't take the same view, then state aid and the like will continue.
I just want to give an opportunity for Andy or Marina to come in at this.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I know that they've just been messaging me, and I know that they have a webinar about their course tomorrow. Before Andy or Marina, you come in on this, I just wanted to mention, Cathal, there are a good number of questions coming in about our own programs in aviation, being whether or not course content might change in the short term, reflecting what's going on with COVID-19, and the second being whether or not it's going to affect the intake of students, so whether more or less places would be available via the CAO, and the last being if there's any comment around what current students are doing in terms of graduate employment. So I just said I'd mention that before either Andy or Marina come in, or yourself, just in case you're going to cover some of the same stuff when you talk.
Well, if either of the other two wanted to offer a view on that, I'd hold off because I've spoken a long time. I can. Oh, good.
I might come in there,
Yeah.
despite the fact that it's Marina's name underneath in the caption there. It's actually Andy McIntyre who's speaking. I'm sure that's obvious to everyone because Marina's far better looking than I am. Just to answer, maybe partly answer the question that's been asked there, Caroline. I mean, so reiterating maybe a little bit what Cathal said earlier on, is that anecdotally we're getting evidence from a lot of people within the industry that the last thing that they want now is for students that are studying or thinking of studying management degrees in aviation to in any way think that they're not going to be in demand. In fact, the complete opposite would be in the case they'd imagine in about 2 years' time, because no matter what happens, the industry will still be around in 2 years' time, but it'll be a different industry, and it'll be a different industry driven by the young people that will be in the industry at that particular time. So where these young people are going to come from, they're going to come from the various degree programs that are taking place at the moment, both in DCU and in various other universities around the country. While in the short term, the employment situation may not be the best, in the medium term, and I'm talking about maybe a year, 2 years' time, the exact type of young people that are being produced by the likes of our course here in DCU are the type of people that would be in demand in order to make these changes that are going to be required in order for the aviation industry to survive and to thrive. In fact, not just survive. So you know, things like, for instance, innovations as regards aircraft design to save on fuel, to save on carbon emissions, how we're going to filter passengers as they go through the airport, efficiencies that have been made. All of these areas will have to be addressed in order for the industry to survive. And I think personally, I hope I'm proven right, that for students, for instance, in the early stages of our course, and for future students that may want to attend the various courses, that there would be real opportunities for them to come in about a year or two's time. Whatever about students in fourth year might be a little bit of a glitch, but there's always the opportunity to further your studies in aviation. And in fact, that's what I'll be speaking about tomorrow when it comes to the webinar we're going to be doing on our MSAL course at DCU. I don't know if Marina wants to come in as well. The other Marina.
No, I mean, I just want to set a more optimistic approach in terms of employability in air transport. My observation is that during the last years, we have seen the traffic being doubled and aviation companies not being able to cover the demand for labor, solely on aviation, but expanding in other industries. So my very optimistic observation in that is students that they have done courses specifically on aviation, either being an undergraduate or a master's or both in some cases, they have a strong advantage versus other candidates that they do not have an aviation business degree. So me personally, knowing the type of the students that we have, I don't really foresee any major difficulties for them getting a decent job in aviation. Yeah, that's my optimistic view. And always there are some employers I would really encourage, especially AMPS graduates, going into placements with IATA and ACI and so on, where they can broaden a little bit their horizons and get to know aviation professionals and increase a little bit their network.
Yeah, the kind of policy-making world there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Cathal, we're at 12:01 and we still have 2 questions to go. So I understand some people may have to drop off the line, but I'm saying we have 2 more questions and then we can wrap up. So if people want to stick on the line for the next couple of minutes while you get through those,
Sure.
is in relation to the wet lease model. What, in your opinion, is the future for such companies?
Well, I suppose, I mean, I'm not very sure, but I suppose insofar as airlines decide they have an excess fleet for the level of demand at the moment, then they wouldn't need to be supplementing that with either dry lease or wet lease arrangements to give them more more capacity.
I'll let the person that asked that come back if they have any follow-up on it.
Sure.
The last question that we have is around governments protecting airlines by granting them government loans or state aid where there is limited competition in the market. So an example there would be the Australian government protecting Virgin Australia.
So what's the question there? Sorry.
The question is, should governments be protecting airlines by granting them
okay, well, there are two countries.
in cases where there's limited competition?
Yeah, there are two countries where governments have stood out against that, that I'm aware of. Australia is one, and Britain is another, where governments have resisted tumbling straight into the laps of airlines in difficulties and offering them money. You know, there was a good relevant joke about Virgin Australia and any other Virgin, where you could imagine a newspaper headline: "Billionaires, please give generously." So you'd expect rich owners of firms, if that is the truth. It's hard to establish the wealth of anybody, to make a contribution as well. But it's true, of course. I mean, it's a common argument presented as regards mergers, maybe in particular. You know, that you know, in the Australian case, but Australia has already, you know, after 9/11, one of its major airlines collapsed. So it might be the case that an Australian government refusal to bail out Virgin would leave Australia with kind of a single substantial airline. The counter argument to that is that there are many airlines all over the world, and by facilitating the entry of foreign airlines into the jurisdiction, that seeming shortage of suppliers might be dealt with. I'm going to say two quick things on an earlier question, if I may, that Andy and Marina spoke about. So I don't see any change in the CAO's assignment of capacity to us or to anybody else. That was one question there. The question is how many students will come forward to fill those places. But I don't think that the students trying to get into DC who can't get in because the CAO has cut the places. Then there was a really important question about content of courses. Will courses take account of the crisis in the future? And Andy and Marina and I will have to talk about that, but I think it would be strange if we didn't.
Yeah. Somebody else just more specifically has subsequently asked whether you anticipate a change in CAO points for the undergraduate program, but I'd imagine we can't answer that at this point. Well,
look, I mean, what happens if for a given capacity in a course, if student demand goes up, the points go up, and if student demand falls, the points fall. So, you know, the thing we need to predict here for answering any of these things, and the thing the college itself would like to know is, will the crisis affect third level education in general, business school education in particular, and maybe aviation courses in particular even more so? And I certainly don't know the answer to that.
Going back to the industry rather than our educational programs, we've got a question here: whether the acceleration of remote working and webinars herald a threat to frequent flyer executive airline travel and therefore future profit margins. I imagine the answer there is yes, right? We're kind of changed now. People are going to be without getting on a plane in future. I don't know.
I think it won't choke off all such travel. There's a big difference. Well, obviously, there's a big difference between a Zoom discussion and a face-to-face discussion, very much affecting education, but meeting. Everybody's probably up to their gills now with all kinds. So it could have some dampening effect, and it will obviously in the short term. But I'm guessing that nearly anybody who had a choice between a Zoom conference or discussion with other executives and a face-to-face meeting, would prefer the latter.
Okay, we're well over, but people are still on the line. But I'll take this as the last question, just because we are over, and I'm sure people want to get on with their day. Does the difficulty associated with onboard preventative health measures inevitably shift any screening measures to airports? If so, who pays for such, and in a manner that doesn't involve passing the cost burden along the aviation value chain? Once you've done that, I think either Marina or Andy would also like to come back in on a separate point probably, but for now, if you could just deal with that question around who will pay for additional screening at airports.
Well, ultimately, it will show up in the ticket price of passengers. Like that's what will happen. The airport doesn't have a pot of gold that it can dip into. The airlines likewise. So everything eventually will flow down into the ticket price. And putting that another way, air travel, for a number of these reasons, will be at least somewhat more expensive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Marina?
Yeah, so I also want to come back a little bit in an earlier question. I know that some of you, you're getting stressed with what you're doing after graduating from AMPS or other courses. And we do have the master's, which is executive, and you might be reading the entry requirements and you might be thinking, oh, maybe I'm not really entitled to, eligible to get into the course. We are here to support you, and there are ways of getting you in the course. So there are ways of submitting a special case form where we can waive the 3 years of minimum employment for getting into the course. And I will share with you the link from the webinar that Andy is hosting tomorrow. So do get back to us what you will be doing after graduating from AMPS or MSAL or anything. We are here. I mean, Caroline is leading the alumni network. Kahel and I were always available. So whatever you need, come back to us. You graduated from DCU. That doesn't mean that the connection between us is broken. You can always come back to us with whatever you need.
We can circulate that link. We'll be sending around an email after this with a link to the recording and to the presentation. So we can also include a link to tomorrow's webinar on the executive program there too. Okay. That's it in terms of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
hang on 1 second. I just want to make sure that we are okay. Yeah, Maria has put that link into chat, and just a couple of nice messages saying thanks very much for the webinar. So thanks a million, Cathal, and I guess that's it from us.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Cathal.
Okay.
Thanks a million.